So, hello there, and welcome again to Half My Age Highlight. I'm Raymond Jetson, and Half My Age Highlight is an opportunity that I take to connect with people who give or take a year or two or a few or half my age, but who are doing really important work to make the world a better place. And my guest for today certainly fits that up and down. I am really excited to have my dear friend and brother Eugene Collins from the Baton Rouge NAACP, who has been a friend, become a friend over the years, and we've crossed paths in a number of different ways. And greetings, Eugene, and thank you for being here.
Hey, brother, thank you for having me today.
So I just want to dive in and start with what has become our traditional conversation started with half my age. Uh, who is Eugene Collins in 25 words or less?
Mr. Jetson, I would like to explain myself as determined, focused, and unbothered. I'm going to cut it down to about four.
Determined,
Unbothered.
focused, and unbothered. Um, and why do you think those are such important descriptors of Eugene Collins at this point in your life?
With some of the fights that the NAACP takes on, and historically have taken on in this city, didn't just start with me. Historically, this great organization has fought in Baton Rouge since 1919. You see it during the inception of some of our great presidents in the 30s. They fought, they fought mob violence. They fought lynchings. We know some of our leaders, they organized the bus boycotts here, integrated schools. In addition to what you see more recently with Kwame Asante and President Lamont Cole, now Mayor Pro Tem Lamont Cole, and his battles, or Mike McClanahan. This organization has been storied. So when you take on some of those fights that this organization just has to take on, it's our mission. Determination is the most important part. You have to be determined because there's going to be times where you're uninvited from spaces because of the fights that you fight, right? And there are going to be moments where people necessarily don't want you around. And you got to be okay with that. You got to be determined towards the goal and towards the mission of making the plight for Black people better. And if you're not, it'll eat you alive. And for me, that determination kind of embodies that. In addition, when you look at focused, keeping the mission first. I often recite to my members that we fight race-based discrimination. We are not a social club. We're not a fraternity. We're not a sorority. We're an organization that fights race-based discrimination. We take on the tough fights. We take on the fights that nobody else wants to touch. We take on the fights that people often will move away from. That's our job. That's our focus. And we have to be focused on that goal at all times, even when it might leave us in some hairy spots. And when you look at unbothered, right? I think, in order to be a great leader within the NAACP, you have to be unbothered. Some things you just got to roll off your back. You can't pay attention to some of the things around you, some of the things that might be said by your friends or in the comment section. You have to have the ability to ignore all of it and keep pushing. Because the moment that you stop and pay attention to some stuff that don't matter towards your goal or your mission, it's taking you off track. And that's where that focus comes in. And that focus definitely goes right in line with being unbothered.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate that. One of the things I share with folks all of the time is sometimes if you're going to be about serious work, you need to not read your mentions. Because, because you're not going to find a fan club there all the time. So Eugene, how would you describe your work today?
Today, if you look at some of the fights that we picked up here recently, and folks will look at the work around police violence and put a lot of weight on that, right? But some of the more important work that we've done lately is violence prevention, and getting out in our communities and making sure that our presence is felt. And whether it works or not, it's about the effort, right? In addition to that, I think the efforts of the NAACP, not only here in Baton Rouge, but statewide, as we look at the case with Ronald Green, a lot of that work that we see that have begun to catch national attention, worldwide attention on some of those cases was birthed right here in Baton Rouge with our social justice committee and our lead advocates and our attorneys and our investigators. That work started right here in Baton Rouge. And we're not an organization that is ever boastful or ever going to jump out and say, we did this or we did that or look at us. That's not the NAACP way. So oftentimes I think people don't really get a clear vision of all the things that we're sometimes engaged in. And I guess from a business model, that might not always be good, but I think it's important to always hold true to the NAACP way. And as a result, I think we've reached some factions of this community that very few organizations have reached. And that don't always equal being invited to the contractual meetings, but it does equal being invited to some tables that very few people with my background are allowed to sit at. And those are the tables that we need to be at to actually serve people that look like you and I, that may not be from a zip code that offers the privilege that some might have.
So Eugene, you touched on two really important things there: police violence and violence prevention. And I watched the national news a few weeks ago, I guess, and saw the attention around the Ronald Green. And I remarked to my wife that, the video that they were showing, I first saw on your social media, literally months before the national news. I also have watched, Eugene, you and the wonderful group of folks who work with you, show up in spaces at hours that a whole bunch of folks are in their houses asleep, just to be present, to be disruptive in a constructive way just by your presence in communities that other folks watch on the local news and talk about in their social media spaces. And so I want to commend you for the very important work. And I know that does not describe all of the work that you personally or in your role as the president of the Baton Rouge NAACP, but I do want to hold it up as being important work. You talked about how this work began in 1919. You talked about over the generations about how this work has evolved. And I want to first of all say that I just want to give major props for that because it's important to understand that we aren't starting some of these struggles. We're actually finding our place in the movement and understand how we advance it further and recognize that it's not going to end with us, that somebody else has to find their space later. But Eugene, how did you end up in this space?
By mistake. I often tell I had no want to be the president of the NAACP. I was working with the statewide branch, helping out, looking into particular cases. Started with all of this as a radio host. Folks started to come and ask for help on different situations that we were bringing advocacy to. So I started looking into some situations. I started doing advocacy a long time ago now as a radio host. And with me, if I do it, I want to be good at it. So I found myself taking online courses on how to investigate different matters. I found myself buying books and just doing my studies here. Because when I looked into these situations, I didn't want to do any family a disservice. So I wanted to know what was basically the rules of engagement around looking into situations, how to investigate, how to file information requests, how to get your hands on certain things that the public never has an opportunity to see. Mr. Jetson is, like you said, that original recording that we know that kind of broke this state police situation open nationally and now a worldwide case was on my social media first. And that was a ton of work that went into identifying the folks that you needed in order to get that information. And I got into this space of doing this work differently because I was out there with advocates some years back, and we were marching. We were doing colorful things, and it looked good on pictures, but we weren't getting no results.
I remember meeting you to have a lunch in front of the Attorney General's office in the aftermath of, I believe it was Alton Sterling's case.
Yeah. And that particular sit-in changed me. Changed the focus of this work. And ever since that sit-in, I was on path to be the president of the NAACP. That particular sit-in showed me that we could have success. We could have results, but it had to be done differently. I often tell people we'll have a march on Saturday and there'll be 3,000 people show up and we'll march on the Capitol on a Saturday evening, but nobody's in the Capitol. So what are you disrupting? What are you forcing? That's a way to work with the system, right? The system allowed you to do that, and you had a police escort all the way down 3rd Street, and everybody got to wear their T-shirts and paint their signs. But at the end of the day, the system allowed you to operate on that day. That is not invoking real change. So when I see those things, that means the system has got together and decided these are the things that we're willing to give. And as a result, in order to quiet the people, we're going to let them gather on Saturday, march to the Capitol. They ask for this list that we already have in place, and then we can go tell people we did real work. I don't want the stuff that they're willing to give us. I want all the stuff they say we can't have. And in order to do that, we got to be forceful about it by any means necessary. And we can't go out there trying to make friends or land consulting contracts. Much too much do we see advocates out there only advocating for themselves. But the tough stuff comes by making people uncomfortable. It comes by making enemies. It comes by not worrying about what friends you lose when you step out what's best for your people.
So to characterize this in a slightly different way, Brother Eugene, we do the Urban Leadership Development Initiative at Metromorphosis, and the first session that we talk to people about making change in community, we have them read a section from a book on real leadership by Dean Williams that talks about the activist challenge. And Dean Williams writes that the challenge of the activist is to point out the hypocrisy between what people say and what's really happening in communities and in organizations. And, so very often when I watch one of your recent interviews about state police, some of the materials that you unearthed is, so here's what's being said about some folks and this organization, but here's what's really happening. And one of the things that Dean Williams says is that the person who calls out the disconnect between what people say and what's real will not be popular. And I think that that's what you find. At least you won't be popular in some circles when you conduct yourself in that way.
And Mr. Jetson, you're spot on, because we started this conversation with that particular sit-in, right? And people don't know, that was a group of folks that organized that sit-in. I don't want to start calling names and leave somebody name, somebody be out there mad at me. But it's a group of people that organized that, and that sit-in lasted 36 days. Historically, that's the longest sit-in of occupying a governmental building in the history of this country. And that happened right here in Baton Rouge sometime in 2019, and very few people talk about it or know it. I don't even think they've changed it in the history books yet, but when you look at those things, we'll often say that we're unpopular, but sometimes it's just because of the people we decide to put ourselves around.
Yes.
We want to be in rooms where we're unwelcome. And I can tell you, I smile here today because I've started to put myself around people that the work actually affected. I do a lot less explaining to people that the work don't affect nowadays. And we often look at that in black and white, and it ain't. Sometimes zip code and income levels, right? Because one of the things of the civil rights movements of the 60s and the 50s, and some can even say the 40s, I look at some elements of that, even though I think that the overall was more difficult, some things was easier, especially messaging to the populace of African Americans, because we all had the same issue. All were fighting for jobs and justice. But Mr. Jetson, now some black folk got money. So their issues ain't necessarily the same as the issues of the person in the bottom or Boulevard bottom or in Banks or in Easy Town. So what I found is I start spending more time in Banks and Easy Town. And I'm welcome over there. You know, it's just some of the folks downtown that have some issues, right? And Brother Malcolm once said, we need an organization that nobody downtown loves. And if that's what we got to be to invoke change, I'm okay with that. Because the people we serve, when we walk in their neighborhoods, they hug us. They invite us inside for plates. We wanted to set us some proverbial table downtown.
Right.
That might not be what God wanted for us.
What concerns you today most about the work?
You know, and I had a talk with a friend yesterday. We fight, I mentioned this earlier, race-based discrimination. So when you go out and you're fighting a racist institution, you expect to encounter racist things on the back half, sometimes on the front half. You expect to see racist people. So it doesn't bother me as much. Some of the things I've been called, some of the things that's been said, me and my daughter, Malia, we often sit around and laugh at it. The more difficult part that I'm finding as I get older is explaining this to people that look like you and I, that you think should have the ability to understand, right? And because we don't always study and know the source of some of the reasons of why we feel the way we feel, the more difficult and challenging part of my job is explaining to Black people that racism exists. And that's the more troubling part, right? But then I read and I study all the time. I was telling somebody yesterday as we had coffee, I study all the time to understand just where we're coming from. And I found that my battle is nowhere new. It's always been that way, especially here in Baton Rouge. And I'll give you an example. Martha White. Martha White sat on the bus long before Rosa did, right here in Baton Rouge. She wasn't remembered for a lot of different reasons. As we look contextual in that part of time, she was a little too dark-skinned to be marketed, right? So that was a part of it. And we got to remember that day that she sat down on that bus here in Baton Rouge, Black people ridiculed and mocked her on that bus. So when you hear that story, it's nothing new. Just like the person that sat down beside her on that bus today and gave her encouragement to keep going was a Black woman. So when we think about all those aspects, we get to understand that our battle is nowhere near new. And when you understand that your battle ain't new, you have to get to the point where you get that complaining, we almost don't deserve it. Because the plight of our elders and our ancestors was so much more difficult than what I'm going through. For me to complain is almost selfish. So we got to keep pushing.
Yeah, but Eugene, you touched on a number of points that are really, really important. First of all, Miss Martha White passed away recently, and so I certainly want to just honor her memory and her sacrifice for what she did. And as you accurately point out, she is kind of the unsung hero, even in the stories we tell locally about the bus boycott, which was a terribly significant event in the civil rights movement. But the other part of what you said, when you talk about, how this thing has progressed and the struggles and battles of the elders, and where you are now, um, I mentioned a moment ago, it's important that we understand that we are not starting something, regardless to the part of the world that we want to change. When rarely, if ever, are we starting something, but rather we are joining into something that started in most instances before we were born. And so understanding where this movement has progressed to and where I fit and how do I use my gifts and talents and abilities to move it forward, is really, really an important part of the work. And so I am grateful, and thankful, and want to acknowledge your perspective on that. One of the other things that I have noticed, Eugene, is that the NAACP seems to be an intergenerational space under your leadership. When I see posts and I am at gatherings and I see the folks who are around you, I see folks from different generations and obviously different walks of life. Uh, why do you believe having all generations involved is important in bringing about change?
Our strength is in our diversity, in our differences, right? Sometimes we look at it as our differences as a way to be divisive, right? But our strengths are derived from how different we can be. So
Mm,
we try to create an environment where multiple walks of folks can participate in NAACP. Not everybody's going to want to march, but they can send an email. Not everybody's going to want to send an email or have the ability to send an email, but they can make a phone call. And we try to provide people with those opportunities to come in and fit in with what they're willing to do. And as they get engaged in the work, we find that people often tend to do a little bit more, but we try to get them engaged in the work. And one of the things I learned from one of my mentors, Reverend Mary E. Moody, she used to always tell me that, Eugene, if you walk in church and you don't hear babies crying, the church is dying.
dead church. It's a dead church.
So, I made it my point when I came in as president of NAACP to recruit younger members, to bring in young people, to add some of that young energy to some of that, the elders' experience and knowledge, and have it mesh. Now, I ain't gonna lie to you, that first year, I thought they were gonna vote me out. But hanging in there, you get to see some of the results of it. You get to see
Yeah,
the fire of a Crystal Ellis, but the steadiness of a Joanne Porter. You get to experience it, right? You get to
right.
see the sharpness of attorney Elena Booth, but you get to see the power that Miss Sheila Butler commands. And that only happens if you have different age groups in the room. But at the same time, we have Fairleigh Cook Jackson, who is starting to drive a whole different population of folks towards the NAACP. I think sometimes people often forget as they talk about, sometimes in misguided thoughts, the organization being an organization of hate or a racist organization. But our largest contributor to date is still white women. Which shows that we're reaching a base of folks that folks don't even understand, because it's about justice.
Yes.
It's about right and wrong. And that's all it comes down to. Because if you're oppressing African Americans, I don't care whether you're blue, black, or green, I'm going to try to come at you as hard as I can.
So Eugene, I am a board member of an organization, Encore, that is advancing this concept of cogeneration, which says that one of the most important elements of tackling the complex and challenging issues that we face is to have people from different generations to come together and design their efforts in a shared process. And when I look at the important work that you and the wonderful folks who are part of the Baton Rouge chapter of the NAACP are doing, I see that concept being lived out in an attempt to respond to race-based discrimination. I want to circle back, Eugene. My last question to you. I want to bring back up something that you led with when I asked you to describe your work, and you talked about police violence. Uh, the NAACP, under your leadership and with the wonderful team of activists and attorneys and investigators and all of those other folks who are part of the effort, uh, you guys have done an amazing job of raising uh, illegal, unethical, immoral, and improper behavior on the part of people who are in law enforcement. And you've been loud voices for police reform. And my final question is, can social justice be achieved without police reform, in your mind?
No, it's not possible. I often tell people, even with all the things that I think we've done, and Mr. Jetson, I think when we look at just how involved we were with the Ronald Reagan case, how involved we were with the historic number of cases that were dismissed with the BRPD narcotics probe. Our social justice chair led that charge. When we look at some of those things, we made the life of a lot of individuals better, but we have not changed the systemic outcomes. And what I say about that is, well, why I say that, that's a poor choice of words. Why I say that is that we saw the jail roster at East Baton Rouge Parish Prison probably get to its lowest point here in the last 2 years. But today, we're right back at about 1,000 folks jailed, right? And not all of those folks need to be there. Some folks need to absolutely be there, but there's a good bit of folks that could probably find other programs. And for a short time there, we saw some of those things happen, but we're right back at that point, right? We saw just this week a civil service board hearing where an officer went to the wrong address, handcuffed a young African-American woman who was 8 months pregnant, walked her outside, put her on a banister, 8 months pregnant, and then set her down. Even after realizing he was at the wrong address, kept her in handcuffs so that she would listen, his own admission. And he got his suspension reduced and his rank back. And not a single person was there to speak in defense of that young African-American woman. So when you look at the system in itself, there's still a lot of safeguards in place that we have not changed. We still have a month-to-month police union contract in this city, one of the only kind like that in this country. We still have civil service protections, one of the few cities in this state with that. We don't see those things just down the street in New Orleans, but we still have those things in place here. So even though our work has helped some individuals, it has not changed the system that impacts these outcomes. So we're stuck depending on having a good police chief, and we have a great one here in Baton Rouge. But if we ever get a bad one, that system is still in place to see the outcomes that we've always seen. And those are the things that we have not changed. I believe that our police department on our current mayor has been more transparent. I believe that they've been more accountable, right? But the system in itself is still in place for any mayor to come behind our current mayor and do exactly what they want to do with it. And until we change those things, we're only helping a few people at a time and not actually changing the system. And those are the things we got to drive a little bit harder at. We got to create systemic change. We have to blow somebody's up. When I say blow somebody up, I'm not talking about that in the literal sense, more the proverbial sense. We gotta get that correct before somebody try to show up at my door about blowing stuff up. But blowing it up systemically, blowing it up somebody's that we have here in Baton Rouge is just antiquated. And you talked about, some of the work and how the NAACP now, we involve attorneys in our work. We work hand in hand with attorneys. We don't march unless we got somebody ready to litigate. We don't do anything or step out on any case unless we have an investigator actually working that case so that we know the details. So when we step out and we tell the general public that we don't want to hear their opinion on this fact, it's because we already know what happened. We just need to find a way to convince y'all that we know what happened. But none of that's new. If we look at the investigative format, the NAACP drives itself from here locally. That's no different than what you would see from Medgar Evers. That role within the NAACP before he was assassinated in 1963, he investigated cases just very similar to what you see me doing here in Baton Rouge. And if it looks similar, it's because I studied his every move and I have done nothing different than what he used to do, right? And that comes in study. In addition, if you look at the way we use attorneys, that's no different than what Johnny Jones did. Sometimes we want to focus so much on being so new and different and innovative, we forget about the old things that used to work. And because we don't read, we don't know that ain't nothing new under the sun, like my grandma said. But I always did it before. We just need to go and find where it happened at. I think we need to get back to some of the basics. We have let social media pull us away from the old things. I've seen people put out posts and get 4,000 and 5,000 likes and have 3 people show up to the council meeting. But I've seen our organization sometimes put stuff out and have 17 people engaged and pack the chambers, because we understand that in getting to the people, it ain't all about, what's happening on social media, who has the best video, who put out the most elaborate post and all of that stuff. It's getting to the core work. It's actually touching people. And if you touch people, you can drive them, you can mobilize them. But you got to first understand your target population. And my target population ain't always Black. Dr. King and all can tell folks, if you really study him, you understand probably what really got him killed. It wasn't the fact that he was fighting for Black people. When he started talking about bringing poor people together, somebody shot him. And that's what we got to get to, is sometimes this fight has become more about income than anything else, and social status. And that's why I ain't gonna lie to you. Mr. Jensen, I don't even put myself around a whole lot of middle-class Black folk no more. I put myself around folks that actually engage in the work, that actually need the work, that actually benefit from the work. They have an understanding for the work, because guess what? The cops that we sometimes fight, and not all cops are bad, they weren't on your block slamming up people up against cars. They were on their block slamming up people up against cars. So they understand it because they looked out their door and saw it. You haven't engaged with police in 10 years because of where you live. And they don't come to 70817 as much as they do 70805. So of course your experience is different, and they ain't got nothing to do with being white or Black.
Yeah. Well, brother, I thank you for your time, Eugene. I thank you for the engagement. But most importantly, I thank you for the sacrifice of your work and your leadership in this community and beyond. And so I wish you the best, my brother, and thank you so much for joining me here on Half My Age Highlight. God bless you.